Good afternoon. This is Dr. Thomas Klein. I'm coming to you from Raleigh, North Carolina. I was a specialist in rare and painful diseases until the North Carolina Medical Board became upset with the way I was treating these patients. I have been quiet since that time because I was threatened with DEA action. The DEA was never involved with this. This was strictly a North Carolina Medical Board that answers to the governor. The reason that I've changed my mind is a recent Supreme Court decision you may not have heard about. It's called the Ruan, R-U-A-N decision. It was a physician who was sentenced to 20 years in prison because the federal government believed he was prescribing too much medicine, which they believed would cause more addiction. The Supreme Court completely reversed 2 district courts and 2 appeals courts that believed this guy should be in prison for 25 years. The only law they can use to prosecute doctors is the same one they used to prosecute El Chapo, which is a drug trafficking law. So when doctors prescribe a lot of medicine and upset and frighten the Department of Justice, you have to prove that the person actually was selling drugs for profit, which they did not do in the case of Dr. Ruan. So the Supreme Court, 9-0, said Dr. Ruan should be set free, and from now on, if the federal government wants to prosecute doctors for overprescribing, they're going to need some new rules. And the rules are you have to knowingly be selling drugs, and you have to knowingly be doing things that doctors don't normally do. Pretty obvious. Doctor can become a drug trafficker, but it's, drug trafficking. So I feel safer, and I think a lot of doctors in the country are now safer. I have 2 colleagues that I got to know during their trials. One is Stephen Henson, MD. He had people in his practice selling his drugs. The federal government and the Department of Justice believes that's the same thing as drug trafficking. In other words, the doctor should have known. Should have known? These people are pros. They work in secret. They trick doctors. Take a prescription down to the pharmacy, get it filled. You could sell it for $5,000 to $6,000. That's a lot of money. So Dr. Henson was actually convicted by a jury, and after a nice presentation by the prosecutors that he was, a drug trafficker, which he wasn't, he got sent to prison 4 years ago, and he's still there. Hopefully he'll be freed under the new Ruan decision, but he was sentenced for life. The federal court judge said, you're an evil person, and you're causing all this addiction and death. Second fellow, Joel Smithers, 36 years old, had 5 kids. He and his wife ran a little practice. Same thing happened. People tricked him, sold their drugs. They accused him of being the drug trafficker. He got 40 years. That's actually more than El Chapo got. The specter of a doctor who's selling drugs is pretty horrible, and juries fall for it, and prosecutors get to rack up another kill because that's how they make their living. Prosecutors need to prosecute. So they actually believe they're doing a moral duty, because opiate addiction has always been associated with immorality, starting back in 1900, as we've talked about before. So now let's roll forward to the spring of 2019, and a complaint was filed against me by a person who was not my patient. Her name was Julia Roy, which is an alias. And this is May 2019. That's an important date. And she showed copies of my Twitter, and what I said on the Twitter was, 99.5% of people, opiates work fine without addiction potential. And guess what? That's true. The second one was, in spite of what some believe, it is legal to travel to see a doctor anywhere in the U.S., legal for any doctor to prescribe any opiate, and without a benzo or muscle relaxant. I was trying to counteract the false narratives that were running around the country. That's also true, and it's been shown to be true by others. I put in here that the Mayo Clinic website, it says opioid use, even short-term, can lead to addiction and too often overdose. That's not true. Prescription drugs don't lead to overdose. Overdoses are caused by heroin addicts who are not being properly treated. So based on that, I made a nice little response, and I didn't hear from the board until 5 or 6 months later, and they said they were starting a formal investigation. Now, wait a minute. I had a perfect record for 45 years. This person was not my patient, and it was not even an issue about medical practice, which is what boards are supposed to deal with. But boards can do whatever they want. They can investigate you for whatever they want. As a little side problem, I was helping out my patients maintain their opiate pain medicines, which they really need to do. You can't even go several days without it without your getting rebound pain. And so I left a credit card on file at the pharmacy, and if a person was really having a hard time with their co-pays, I would lend them the money and then they would pay me back. I was investigated for that. So they opened. They wanted, an investigator came here and sat in my office. I was not informed. I did not have to have them visit, but I thought I would have anyway. And I thought maybe I could explain to them my unusual practice. And I did. The investigators initiated a 100-page report on me and found nothing. These are the board investigators. These are experienced people. They didn't find anything. So then the next thing they wanted is to review 9 of my charts. Who did they talk to? They only talked to a pharmacist. During this time, I was never able to speak to any of the board members. I had an unusual practice, and it would have been nice to sit down with a couple of the board members and explain what's going on and the research that I had done to justify those Twitter. I wasn't allowed. My attorney requested a visit with just 2 or 3 board members, and it was denied. The entire case was run by the board lawyer. This is a problem with lots of boards. I can see what goes on. People, they volunteer for this job or they're paid very low, and then they just want the lawyer to handle it. But you don't know what the lawyer's up to. You don't know what the lawyer's background is or biases are. So the next thing they did is they hired an outside reviewer to look over these 9 charts, a person unknown to me. And the way they operate, they wouldn't tell me who it was. We were not allowed to see the CV to find out whether or not this person was a true peer reviewer. When doctors are reviewed, they have to be reviewed by somebody in their own specialty called peer review. If we're reviewing a plumber, we don't send an electrician in to review the plumber. It has to be a peer. This goes back to 1240. And the Magna Carta. The principle is if you're accused of something, you have to be seen by your peers. This happens in the military. If a colonel is charged, there aren't sergeants on the case. You have to have generals and other colonels. Very, very important. It turns out that this fellow he picked 6 of the 9 charts and reviewed them. He wrote a 60-page review with an average of 20 wrongdoings per patient. So what do you do? they've hired an outside reviewer who we're not allowed to talk to, who we don't know the name or specialty, but I could tell he was from a pain clinic and probably an anesthesiologist, because in reading his report, you could see that he didn't really have a good grasp of regular practice. And he was making a lot of false statements, so many false statements that my attorney filed a report, a 10-page report that took him 2 days to do, refuting all of the charges, except for doesn't keep good records, which is true of all doctors, because there's no standard. You can pick up a record and say, well, this is no good. He should have had this. He really should have put this in here. The key thing about medical boards, they're there to protect the public from bad doctors. The most common problem I see in these reports are doctors who are alcoholics or on drugs. That clearly is going to be a danger to people. What happened in this case was the danger was for the patients, because they eventually decided they would keep after me until they got me off the streets. There was some little gossip going around that Dr. Klein's in his twilight years. We also have a pattern with the boards and the federal government of going after individual doctors, because they're afraid that these individual doctors don't have any controls and are just wildly prescribing drugs, over-prescribing pain medicine. Now, it's very important at this point, and we've talked about it in previous videos, the belief that more pills cause more addiction is true for a couple of addictions like cocaine and methamphetamine. And if you control the substance, you will control the addiction. Opiate addiction is different. It runs in families. It's triggered all of the sudden. When you take your first opiate, if you've never had an opiate in your whole life, and you take your first one, you go to the moon, like a doctor I know at Mass General, you've just triggered the opiate addiction. So opiate addiction is different. There's never actually been a reported case of anybody developing opiate addiction after they've started on long-term treatment. Now, that's going to blow away a lot of arguments. For example, all these court cases, if the manufacturer puts out too many pills, the distributor puts out too many pills, the doctor puts out too many pills, it's going to cause more addiction. Nope, not at all. Because they don't understand the biology of opiate addiction. And that makes it kind of ironic, because this board closed my career. And what they did was, in about a year after this started, they called me up on a holiday, President's Day. I was here with my family, and said, we're coming to take your DEA prescribing license. Now, only in the United States do we doctors have to get a separate license from the federal government through the federal police, the DEA, in order to prescribe opiate pain medicines and other controlled substances. This is peculiar to this country. In Canada, if they want to prescribe heroin, which is still legal in Canada, it's a good painkiller, by the way, it's called diamorphine, they just do it. If they want to treat an addict, they just do it. If I treat an addict, I'd be arrested. So we've got a very bizarre kind of view of pain medicines. Opiates and heroin are all pain medicines. Nothing peculiar about them, they're pain medicines. 95% of manufacturing of opiates goes for the treatment of pain. So we've been cutting back on opiates, hoping that it'll reduce addiction and overdoses. Guess what? It has not. In 6 years, the overdose deaths are increasing, and increasing at a more rapid rate since the CDC guidelines went in and we tried to control pills. The central problem is more pills cause more addiction. And that's true for everything except opiates. So what happened next is then the negotiations start. This cost me about $30,000, and I could have gone before the board with a regular full hearing, which would have been another $50,000. I had to borrow the money to start with. So what they want is they want to kill So I said, okay, I agree to going inactive, which means I can actually activate my license. I would not do that with this Board of Medicine, considering what goes on behind the scenes and the fact that the lawyers are unregulated. I talked to somebody in California. In California, as soon as a complaint is filed, you get to talk to a board member. I have never talked to a board member. So then you start negotiating what's called a consent. So this is the report from the board that goes public and stays public for the rest of your life about what you did. And you can look it up, and it's there. And basically, they insisted on putting all this negative information in there. But if you read it carefully, you'll see it's got nothing to do with patient care. And it was a way to stop all this. Because, you know, my medical career was over because I was only treating people with chronic pain. And this is what got them off center. Any doctor that only treats patients with opiates is immediately targeted for investigation. We did not have a chance to really respond to the outside reviewer. We could only do that if we went to the $50,000 full hearing. And the board lawyer said, if you do go to a full hearing, which they didn't want because there were some other embarrassing things that happened concerning a PhD doctor from Boston by the name of Michael Chapman that actually tweeted that I was going to lose my license before we were notified. Dr. Chapman, we have several of his tweets here that he had advance information. The board can contact anybody they wish, but it's confidential. And Dr. Chapman was an old nemesis of mine. Where they dug him up, I'll never know. But it's hard to imagine what this guy was telling them behind the scenes. So the whole thing really started to smell bad. And so my lawyer and I decided that if we did go to a full hearing, they would crucify us. The board can request a judge so that you can have a fair hearing, but we could not. It's in the rules that we cannot. So if we'd had a fair judge, we'd do it. But if you just sit before the board and the board lawyer takes over the prosecution like Perry Mason, they guaranteed me my license would be revoked. Now, when you revoke a license, that means you never, ever can practice. At least I could file for a reinstatement. So they had me. And then, as I mentioned, they said, the DEA is aware of this case. The DEA works with boards because they let the board do the investigation, and as soon as they find out the guy's guilty, the DEA just picks it up and goes to court, federal court, with the Department of Justice and gets their long-term prison sentence. So I was facing the possibility of them coming here, taking my records, solo practitioner, older, and ending up in federal prison like my two guys that I told you about. So that's why I've been quiet. It's a real threat. It's not like they're coming to get you because you've committed a crime. They're just coming to get you. I mean, this is like the Stasi for doctors, you know. I still, every time I hear a car in a driveway, I jump. Imagine now if I had, after treating 34 patients and restoring their lives, that I was dragged off to federal court and ended up in prison for 20 years, like Dr. Ruan, that the Supreme Court reversed. This is not going to stop until the courts become involved. And we need to do some revision of the boards and how they operate. There should always be an appeal system. There's no reason to deny a physician who's under investigation talking to physicians on the medical board. But that's what happened. So that's what happened to me. And do I have any sour grapes? I mainly have sour grapes for all the patients around the country that get screwed. Now, my patients, fortunately, because doctors just volunteered to help out of the blue, it was just a miracle, they all got cared for. But this is very rare. This doesn't happen. And once patients, let's say normally in a pain practice, it might be 200 or 300 patients, are then labeled as coming from a doctor's practice that was sanctioned for drug abuse. How many of those do you think will get to see doctors? None. We have 7 million people in the United States that have been taken off their pain medicines because of the belief that more pills cause more addiction, which is not true. It's a very sad state of affairs, and we are working at JATH, J-A-T-H, Educational Consortium. I'm also a consultant to the National Pain Council, and we're all working together to try to fix this. And if anybody wants to join the National Pain Council, they can do so by just Googling National Pain Council and signing up. What's my future? My future is to do research, to help people write articles, go to legislatures, fix problems like medical boards, and protect people from the rapacious attack on them by the federal government and the CDC. Good night.